So in this video, we're going to see a simple example of how exceptions work in Java. So to start off with, I have a very simple program. I have a main method. I declare an integer called num that I assign 10, and then I print it out. And then my output is num is equal to 10, which is what you would expect. So let's suppose I want to cause some trouble. And I'm going to declare an integer called 0 that I'll assign to 0. And then I'm going to say that num is now equal to 3 divided by 0. Now this will cause an exception. But let's go ahead and run this anyway, just so that we can see what happens. And you'll see in thread main, we have an arithmetic exception, division by 0, and notice we never print num is equal to 10. The way we handle exceptions in Java is with a try block. So we say try, and then we have some code. And if there's an exception here, so here we're going to catch an arithmetic exception. Whoops, that's all one word. And I'll call it except. And if that happens, we'll print that you can't divide by 0. So now when we run this, notice it says, hey, you can't divide by 0, and then num is equal to 10. Now, if you remember from that original time when we got the exception, everything printed in red, and that was because we actually printed to the error stream. And we could do that in Java by, instead of saying system.out, we say system.error. And when we do that, now you see that that shows up as red. That's actually two separate streams that we can handle differently. So we'll do that to print our error messages. I'm going to declare a number after num, and that's going to be 30. And then for after num, I'm going to set after num equal to negative 30. And this is so we can see if this changes or not. And then I'm going to print after num when we're done. So here I'm setting it to negative 30. It was 30. Now I'm setting it to negative 30, but I need to spell it right. And that should do it. So now notice after num is 30. It's not negative 30 because this code was never actually executed. Let's do before num, which we'll set to 20. And then before our exception, we'll set it equal to negative 20. And here you can see that we don't print it out, so you can't see anything. So let's print that out at the end. Now when we run this code, notice before we actually execute this line, it's now negative 20. But this line never gets executed because as soon as we have this exception, it goes to the catch block. Another issue maybe that you might notice is there's no way to tell where the exception happened. Other than if you looked at the source code, hey, you can see that this is the line that got called. So I can, in that exception object, call the method print stack trace. And if I do that, notice now I get that full error message we had before. And so this is good for debugging purposes. And then here, this is a nice error message to the user. So let's leave that there just so that we have that. And let's put in a blank line here. Just to give us some room. Okay, so that looks good. So let's also, at the very start of this, let's print what num is. Actually, in fact, let's print everything. We'll put a blank line there, and then we'll say, here's before the try block. And then we'll say after the try block. So then we can kind of see how those values all changed. So there's another thing we can do, and that is have a finally block. So now in the finally block, whether there's an exception or not, this code is going to get executed. So let me have a finally num. We'll set that equal to 40. And then here we'll make it negative 40 so that we can see if it gets changed. And let's add a print statement as well. And I'll copy that down to the end of our code as well. So now if we run this, we have our before, we have our after. And one thing you may notice is that this stuff is now at the end. Well, we did this during the catch block, but we printed it to the error stream, which is actually a separate string. And in this case, that took longer to do than the rest of this. So now that we have that finally block, you'll notice this shows up in different places just depending on how the execution works. We don't have to treat them as one whole. This can go anywhere after that exception goes. It's just a matter of when that particular text gets put onto that stream. So don't be too concerned with if this is in the or in some sort of strange order. So let's just divide this by 1 to show what happens if there's no exception. Because notice finally this got set equal to negative 4 or negative 40 because we did the finally block. But if there's no exception, notice everything works, but finally is still negative 1. Before, after, and finally all get changed. Before and after and finally. Now if we leave the exception there, then notice finally is still negative 40. So before it gets changed because that happens before the exception. Finally gets changed because that happens in the finally block. And after doesn't because the exception gets caused. So in a try block, the code gets executed. As soon as there's an exception detected, then we look for a corresponding catch block to handle that exception. So this is an arithmetic exception. So we know that it will handle division by 0. We could do something, whatever we need to do to recover from the error or whatever that needs to be. And then in our finally block, we can put code that we want to run whether or not there is an exception in the try block. So the finally block, within reason, is going to always get run. Now, yes, if something happens to your computer, if your computer catches on fire, if the Java virtual machine crashes, if something horrible happens, then yeah, sure, this won't execute. But in general, the finally block will always be executed whether or not there's an exception in the try block. And then the catch block will only be executed if a corresponding exception is caught in the try block. So we'll have some other examples of exceptions, but this hopefully gives you an idea of how, in general, exception handling works in Java.